The evening settled over Harbor Haven Hotel like a held breath. Evie stood near the lobby windows, watching the last traces of daylight fade into the ocean. The harbor lights were beginning to flicker on, dotting the waterfront with soft yellow glows. Inside, the hotel maintained its usual rhythm. Guests moving through the dining room, the soft clink of silverware, low conversations drifting through the air. Everything looked normal, but Evie could feel the undercurrent of unease, like a frequency only certain people could hear. She'd spent the last hour thinking about Suite 103 and the guest who hadn't been seen all day. The small details kept circling in her mind. The crooked room number plaque, the scuff mark on the carpet, the door that had been ajar and then closed again. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern she couldn't quite name yet. The hotel manager finally emerged from the back offices, his expression carefully neutral. He was a composed man, someone who'd managed the Harbor Haven for nearly 15 years and had seen his share of guest eccentricities. But Evie noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the lobby as if checking to make sure everything appeared undisturbed. He spoke briefly with the front desk clerk, keeping his voice low. Evie couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language, measured concern, the kind that comes from wanting to handle something quietly before it becomes public knowledge. When he finished, he retreated back toward the administrative wing without making announcements or drawing attention. That, more than anything, told Evie this was serious. She made her way toward the event planning office, her official reason for being at the hotel. The weekend wedding preparations were mostly complete, but there were always small tasks: confirming table arrangements, checking on floral deliveries, reviewing the timeline with the catering staff. Work that kept her moving through the hotel, observing, listening. As she passed through the main corridor, she encountered the housekeeper she'd spoken with earlier. The woman was pushing her cart slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the suite wing. When she saw Evie, she stopped. "They're sending someone to check the room," the housekeeper said quietly. "Management finally decided it's been too long." "When?" Evie asked. "Soon. Maybe within the hour." The housekeeper glanced down the hallway. "I've been working here 12 years. I've never felt quite like this before. It's probably nothing, right? He probably just went for a long walk and lost track of time." Evie offered a small, reassuring smile, though she didn't entirely believe it herself. "I'm sure there's an explanation." The housekeeper nodded, but she didn't look convinced either. She continued pushing her cart, but Evie noticed she took a different route, avoiding the hallway to Suite 103 altogether. Evie returned to the event office and busied herself with paperwork, but her mind kept drifting. She thought about the guest who'd mentioned seeing the missing man on the bench the previous evening, staring out at the water with that distant expression. She thought about the envelope he'd kept tucking into his jacket pocket, as if protecting something private. What had been in that envelope? And why had it mattered enough to keep hidden? The bellhop from that morning appeared in the doorway, looking for the event coordinator. When he saw Evie instead, he hesitated. "Can I help you?" Evie asked. "I was just wondering if anyone had heard from the guest in 103, he said. "I carried his luggage up when he checked in 3 days ago. He seemed, I don't know, preoccupied maybe, like he had something weighing on him. Did he say anything to you?" The bellhop thought for a moment. "Not much. Just asked about the quietest parts of the hotel. Wanted to know if there were areas where people didn't usually go." I told him the West Terrace was pretty secluded in the evenings. Evie filed that away. Did you see him go there? I saw him walking that direction once. Yesterday evening, I think. Around sunset. The bellhop shifted his weight. I probably shouldn't be gossiping about guests. You're not gossiping, Evie said gently. You're being observant. That's different. He seemed relieved by that distinction and left to attend to his duties. The West Terrace. Evie hadn't been out there in days. It was one of the older parts of the hotel, but it offered privacy, and lately, Evie was beginning to understand that privacy might have been exactly what the missing guest was looking for. She made her way through the hotel's side corridors, past the small library room where an elderly couple sat reading, past the closed door of the business center. The route to the West Terrace took her through a narrower hallway, one lined with old photographs of SeaHarbor from decades past. When she stepped outside onto the terrace, the cool evening air wrapped around her. The sound of waves against rocks was louder here, more insistent. The terrace was empty. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Just weathered furniture, a few planters with struggling shrubs, the metal railing that bordered the edge overlooking the water. But then, near the far corner where the shadows gathered more thickly, she noticed something. A folded piece of paper, tucked partially beneath one of the chairs, as if it had been dropped or blown there by the wind. Evie picked it up carefully. It was hotel stationery, the kind left in guest rooms. The paper had been folded and unfolded several times, the creases worn soft. On it, written in neat but hurried handwriting, were just a few lines. Can't stay silent anymore. Too many years of looking away. He needs to know the truth, even if it costs me everything. No signature. No date. No indication of who he was or what truth needed telling. This wasn't just a guest who'd wandered off and lost track of time. This was someone carrying something heavy. Something that had brought them to Harbor Haven for a reason. She returned inside and made her way back toward the lobby. The hotel manager was standing near the front desk now, speaking with a uniformed police officer. Not the detective, just a local officer, the kind who handled routine calls and minor disturbances. The conversation looked calm, almost casual, but Evie knew better. The missing guest had been officially reported. Evie didn't approach them. She simply moved through the lobby, observing. The officer was taking notes, nodding as the manager explained the situation. No signs of distress in the room. No indication of foul play. Just an absent guest and growing concern. The officer said something about checking the beach, the local restaurants, the usual places someone might go. The manager agreed, though his expression suggested he didn't think they'd find the guest wandering around town eating fish and chips. Evie stepped into the small gift shop adjacent to the lobby, pretending to browse postcards while keeping one ear on the conversation. The officer mentioned that without evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do immediately. Adults had the right to come and go as they pleased. But he'd file a report and keep an eye out. It was a reasonable response. A measured response. But it didn't account for the note Evie had found on the terrace. As the officer left, Evie considered her options. She could show the note to the manager, turn it over to the police. But something made her hesitate. The note was personal, confessional. Whoever wrote it hadn't meant for it to become public. And Evie had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to understand a situation was to follow the threads quietly before pulling them into the light. She needed to know more about the missing guest. Who he was. Why he'd come to Harbor Haven. What truth he'd been carrying that felt so heavy it might cost him everything. The front desk clerk was still at her station, reviewing paperwork. Evie approached casually, as if she were just passing through. "Long day," Evie said with a sympathetic smile. The clerk looked up, grateful for the brief distraction. "You have no idea. I keep thinking he's going to walk through that door any minute with some perfectly reasonable explanation, and we'll all feel silly for worrying." "What was his name?" Evie asked, keeping her tone light and conversational. "David Kerrigan. Checked in 3 days ago. Quiet man, maybe mid-50s. Paid in cash, which was unusual but not unheard of." The clerk glanced at her screen. He didn't make any phone calls from the room. Didn't order room service. Barely interacted with staff at all. Did he mention why he was visiting SeaHarbor? "He told me he used to live here. Years ago. Said he was back to take care of some old business." The clerk's expression turned thoughtful. He seemed sad about it, honestly. Like he wasn't looking forward to whatever he'd come here to do. Old business. A truth that needed telling. A weight he couldn't carry anymore. Evie thanked the clerk and moved away, her mind working through the information. David Kerrigan had lived in SeaHarbor before. That meant he had history here. Connections. Maybe people he needed to face. She thought about the note again. He needs to know the truth. Who was he? Someone local? Someone still living in SeaHarbor? She'd lived in SeaHarbor her whole life, delivered mail to half the town for 40 years. She knew the permanent residents, could spot the tourists and weekenders. If David Kerrigan had come back to confront someone, that someone might still be here. Near the window, an older man sat alone, eating slowly. Evie recognized him. Thomas Brennan, a retired contractor who'd lived in SeaHarbor for at least 30 years. He kept to himself mostly, polite but distant. As Evie passed his table, she noticed his hands were trembling slightly, enough that his water glass shook when he lifted it. He seemed distracted, his food barely touched. It might have meant nothing, but Evie had learned to trust her instincts about people. And something about Thomas Brennan's demeanor felt off. He looked like a man waiting for something, or dreading it. She didn't stop at his table, just noted it and moved on. By 8 o'clock, the hotel had settled into its evening rhythm. Guests retired to their rooms or gathered in the lounge for drinks. The manager had retreated to his office. The front desk operated with quiet efficiency. Evie returned to the event office and sat down at the small desk, pulling out the note she'd found. She read it again, searching for details she might have missed. Can't stay silent anymore. Whatever David Kerrigan had come to say, he'd been ready to say it. But something had stopped him. Or someone had. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. The housekeeper stood there, her face pale. "They opened the room," she said quietly. "Suite 103. Evie stood. "Anne, he's not there. But his things are. His suitcase is unpacked. His toiletries are in the bathroom. His wallet and phone are on the nightstand." The housekeeper's voice dropped even lower. "Everything except him." Evie felt a chill run through her. People didn't leave their wallet and phone behind. Not unless they didn't plan on coming back. Or unless they couldn't. Did they find anything else? Evie asked. The housekeeper hesitated. There was a photograph. On the bed. Like he'd been looking at it. It showed 2 men younger, maybe in their 20s. Standing in front of a construction site. One of them looked like Mr. Kerrigan. The other, she paused. The manager said it looked like Thomas Brennan. From years ago. Evie's pulse quickened. Thomas Brennan. The man sitting alone in the dining room, hands trembling, food untouched. Where is the manager now? Evie asked. Still in the suite. With the officer. They called him back. Evie thanked the housekeeper and stepped into the hallway. Her mind was moving quickly now, connecting pieces. David Kerrigan and Thomas Brennan had known each other. Years ago. There was history between them, something captured in that old photograph. And now David Kerrigan was missing, and Thomas Brennan was sitting in the hotel dining room looking like a man haunted. Evie made her way back toward the dining room, moving with purpose but not urgency. She didn't want to alarm anyone, but she needed to see Thomas Brennan's face when she asked him about David Kerrigan. When she entered the dining room, she found his table empty. Thomas Brennan was gone. Evie looked around quickly. A server was clearing a nearby table. "Excuse me," Evie said. "The man who was sitting here, did you see where he went?" The server nodded. "He left in a hurry. Maybe 5 minutes ago. Looked upset. Headed toward the back exit." Evie felt her instincts sharpen. She moved toward the back hallway, past the kitchen, past the staff break room. Through the window, she could see the parking lot, dimly lit by overhead lamps. A figure was walking quickly across the pavement, shoulders hunched against the evening chill. Thomas Brennan. Evie pushed through the exit door and followed, keeping her distance. The air outside was colder now, the wind carrying the smell of salt and motor oil from the docks. Thomas walked with purpose, heading down the service road toward the water. Evie stayed back, watching. He stopped near one of the old storage buildings, the kind that hadn't been used in years. He stood there for a moment, looking around as if making sure he was alone. Then he pulled out a set of keys and unlocked the door. Evie's heart was pounding now. Through the partially open door, she could hear voices. Low, tense. One of them was Thomas Brennan's. The other voice was weaker, strained. But it was there. Someone was inside that building. And Evie was willing to bet everything she had that it was David Kerrigan.